Ashoka was a mighty warrior. He had an extremely Machiavellian prime minister who plays a very interesting role in Buddhist history. And he basically conquered the Indian subcontinent through warfare. The story is that at some point in the process of this conquest, he was introduced to Buddhist thought, began to feel very, very badly at the bloodshed that had sort of accompanied the warfare that he had been waging for years, chose to become a Buddhist, chose to run his empire in a different way through compassion and good works rather than warfare, and went out of his way to spread Buddhism. So he found the 7 groups of reliquaries that had been dispersed so many years ago. He mysteriously multiplied them, we don't know how, and he built 84,000 stupas, which allowed him to spread these relics not only throughout India, but he is supposed to have sent some to Sri Lanka and Burma, definitely to parts of Afghanistan, and possibly as far west as some of the Eastern Greek centers. Did I get as far? Yes, I got that right. Okay. What he did to mark the place where these relics are is he built these enormous burial mounds, which are known in Indian traditions as stupas, but which are not unlike the kurgans of Central Asia or even the barrows of early Celtic tradition. This, which is probably the most famous one in India, is at a site called Sanctity. It is usually thought to date to the 1st century BC to the 1st century AD, and it is basically a rebuilding later on by another group of one of the first stupas established by the Indian Indian Emperor Ashoka. And it is the beginning, for many ways, of our study of relics, but also of religious art in Buddhism. So essentially what you have is this towering mound. Can you see the little person here to give you a sense of the scale of this thing? It's solid. There's a balcony on the top and a parasol. And the parasol, theoretically, marks the pillar that is in the center of it. There are 4 gateways marking the 4 cardinal directions. And what you do is you walk into the enclosure between the gateways and the monument, and you walk around it. And the focus of the devotion at this site is not the monument itself. It is the relics that it contains. Stupas are found throughout all of Buddhist Asia, and they are the source for what many of us know as the East Asian pagoda. So this is Horyuji in Japan. This is probably the earliest wooden buildings in the world. They date to the 7th century AD. And this is the pagoda in the Horyuji, which functions exactly the same way as the stupa in India, so that this is the core of the monastery. There are many, many other buildings. This is the marker for where the relics are. Everybody's supposed to have relics. And this is the main image hall. And you can see that they become, by the 7th century, equal in some senses. You find the stupa or the pagoda in many, 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 many forms in Asia. In some cases, this is actually a monastery in China. It is used as a cemetery. So all of the monks who worked at this famous monastery, this is the Shaolin Monastery, are buried under, their remains are encased in or buried under these forms. And they're also found in miniature form. These are all from our collection. Just to give you a great overview, this is Indian, 4th century, Indian, 12th century, Nepali, 11th, 12th century, Japanese, 8th century. These are all bronze. This is wood. These then function as many, many things in the Buddhist world. They remain markers or signifiers for the immanence of the historical Buddha. So the idea that this being who lived a long time ago somehow remains, even though he's transcended mortal concerns, has remained in the phenomenal world to talk to all of us, to deal with us, to guide us, and to teach her. They are, as signifiers of the presence of the historical Buddha, images that are the focus of devotion themselves. So they are seen as sacred statements. They are worshipped, and they are, in some cases, but not all cases, reliquaries for later practitioners. They exist in a great many ways. Oh, that isn't what I thought I wanted. Excuse me. I think I lost one. Okay. So they exist in a great many ways. If you go back to the great stupa at Sanctity, one of the things you will find, and this is actually another stupa from the place, is that the relics were were nested, often nested reliquaries, and they were embedded in many things. So this is sort of a cross-section of one of the stupas at Sanctity. And you can see that it's actually not hollow. You can't walk into it. It's a solid thing, except in the middle. There's this little reliquary chamber. In the reliquary chamber, there's a wooden box. In the wooden box, there's or in some cases, a stone box. Then there's a stone container, another stone container, and another stone container. So the relics are nestled, and they are either within these sort of non-hollow or full sculptures, or they are underneath them. And over time, a great many of them have been found and excavated. This is probably the most famous one. It's in the British Museum. It was excavated in 1833 inside a stupa in Afghanistan at a site called Bimaran, and is therefore known as the Bimaran Reliquary. Given the fact that it is made of a very, very pure form of gold and embellished with garnets, it is assumed that this was the innermost of all of the nested reliquaries. It's about 2 to 3 inches high, and it contained, when it was opened up and found, burnt pearls, beads, and coins. It is decorated, it is carved in a repoussé technique, and it's essentially decorated with standing figures that are thought to be representations of Buddhas and other figures that are thought to be representations of bodhisattvas. This, again, was probably an interior reliquary. It's ours. You can visit it in our Indian galleries. It is particularly interesting because it has an inscription on it in a script that is known as Kharosthi, which was the primary, or one of the primary mercantile languages on the Silk Road from about the 2nd century BC to the 4th century AD. This one tells us the name of a ruler of a petty kingdom somewhere in Pakistan. His name was Indravarman, and he claims on this reliquary that it contains the ashes or the remnants of the historical Buddha, the man who had died probably 400 years earlier. In fact, Buddhist texts tell us that by this point in time, there were many, many kinds of relics. You may recognize the piece Alyssa showed you that's on view in her exhibition, and this is actually on view in our galleries. There were corporeal relics. So there were relics like finger bones and ashes and things that were thought to actually be some part of the person who was being celebrated in the reliquary. And we know from inscriptions on them that fairly early on in Buddhist practice, it was not only the historical Buddha Shakyamuni whose relics were preserved, consecrated, and revered. It was many of his disciples, as well as those practitioners of Buddhism which were thought to have achieved a certain point in their spiritual development. There were also relics of use. So things like the begging bowl that would have been used by a monk at that point in time, clothing worn by sacred figures would be cut up, put into small pieces, and also put into reliquaries. And as you can see from the 2 pieces that I'm showing you here, where the relics are basically coins, little gold containers, pieces of crystal, pieces of pearl, it was also assumed that you could have relics of significance. So you could put things that were precious or semi-precious into a reliquary and assume that they would signify all of the things that the relics of use or the corporeal relics would need.